Hey, Edward Dodge here, Lost Goddess IO podcast, very special episode. I'm talking to Dr. Robert Price, the renowned theologian and prolific author of many books on the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, and really one of the most well-known scholars out there. So it's a privilege to get a chance to speak to him again. We've spoken a couple times before, so but we're going to continue today. Hi, Dr. Bob. How you doing today? Has anything you'd like to say to everybody?
No, it's great. Yeah, I sure appreciate the interest in all these interesting topics.
Great. Yeah, so I'm trying to do something a little bit different with my work at the moment. I have been I sort of feel like I stumbled into this story of Asherah in the Old Testament. And what really struck me was that how much, when I started digging into these traditions, because I had never heard of Asherah, and it sort of blew my mind when I started hearing about a wife of God, what that could mean at a practical level, at a cultural level. Like literally, what did these people believe back in the day when they were worshiping Asherah, who I'd never heard of? And so when I started digging into it and learning about that these are part of the mystery religions, and that this is a suite of interconnected traditions across the Near East, that these goddesses are just these traditions repeat the spiritual motifs, and the symbols repeat from one culture to the next, and they're just changing the names. So like Astarte in the Old Testament is Ishtar, and Asherah compares to Rhea of the Greeks, or Cybele, and other mother goddesses. The thing that clicked for me was recognizing that in these traditions, there's a lot of like, basically sex and drugs and music and dance and a lot of stuff that associates with in nature worship, and that it's all about nature worship, and that it really tracks to today's counterculture. And it tracks to what we see going on today with the modern day, the hippies and the counterculture across the board, and the people that are committing these, what would be called viceless crimes today. The things that some people think are immoral, and that other people don't agree are immoral at all. And that we have these cultural views that say, non-marital sex is immoral, or using psychedelic plant drugs is immoral and illegal. But other people, other cultural traditions think this stuff is just fine. And so what just really struck me was how it was like a direct comparison between all the stuff that we argue about in today's conflicts over like more vice crimes, really, and these disputes, these moral disputes in our culture wars, how directly it tracks back exactly to these reformations that happened back in the day. And so that was the story that has really struck with me the whole time. And the more I started thinking about it, the more the idea of the divine feminine and the wife of God started to make sense for me theologically. And it started to fit the gaps and questions I'd had in why I didn't call myself a Christian anymore. Because I left the church for a lot of the same reasons other atheists have left the church. The Christian theology just didn't really make sense to me. Atonement didn't really make sense to me. Like, how did Jesus forgive my sins? Like, how does that work? Like, it doesn't really make sense. And heaven and hell never made sense. And again, a lot of this morality that wasn't really obvious to me. Why certain behaviors are being condemned. Like, why is marijuana condemned when alcohol and tobacco are like celebrated and the backbone of an economy? It never really made sense to me. So when I tracked it back and realized it tied back to these old religious reformations, that's when it struck my fancy to really want to dig into these stories and try to make sense of them. And I found in these discussions that I'm really not an atheist. That like in these debates between the atheists and Christians, I don't find myself siding with either side. Like, I can agree with the atheists when they're critiquing Orthodox Christianity, but I agree with the Christian but I find myself agreeing with this sort of the deist arguments about God and certainly the mystical side and the spiritual side of mystical traditions. I've always actually been quite interested in, like going back, when I was in college, and finding that that mystics, like a Christian mystic and a Hindu mystic and a Buddhist mystic, can all agree on their views. Like, they can find consensus, and their views can dovetail, and there's no real contradictions between the spiritual seekers who are not hung up on orthodoxy. I mean, do you agree with me on that kind of thing?
Yeah, there are important nuances of difference, but ultimately, well, like in all religions, given the fact that conditions in all cultures are sufficiently the same, that certain issues are always going to come up, like if there is a good God who created and ruled the world, how did it get to be the mess it is? And then there will be several options to explain that. And I think there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel. People with the same structured minds facing the same issues are going to come up with the same options again and again. So there's a whole lot of analogy between the religions. And I think specific doctrines do begin to kind of fade once you get into a mystical thing. I mean, there remains like Judaism has mysticism, but they never really overcome the difference between God and mortals, though the Kabbalah comes kind of close to it. It's panentheistic, but that's that almost is beside the point. But I think that's correct, and in broad terms. And this is sometimes called the perennial tradition, that it seems real old and held in common by people that probably were very surprised to see their own beliefs reflected in other religions when they first encountered them. So it does, and even atheists and naturalists in the great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James says that, look, we know of atheists that have had these flashes of unitive consciousness, feeling that they're one with everything. Yes. They don't really draw any doctrines from it, but the experience is wholesome and edifying. I know militant atheists who, one or two of them anyway, who also happen to be interested in martial arts, and they say there's a mystical feeling associated with some of those exercises, yogic type feelings, but they realize that doesn't translate into veridical statements about metaphysics. You can't really be sure it's anything but experience, but it seems to be a wholesome experience. And so even there, it's not that different. You can have transcendent experiences and be changed by them. I'm guessing that's what happened with Terence McKenna and people like that. I don't know if they had any religious beliefs or not, but the experiences they had, it seems like that was an end in itself. It was good enough. You didn't have to go beyond it to explain it. The thing is to experience it, and if you're trying to explain it, you're already a big step removed from it.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's a really great way to put it all. You know, it's that mystical experience of the connection to that unitary divine consciousness, that sort of universal love, to some people will put it that way, but it's really about that sort of universal connection to all life that can't really be empirically defined. It can't be empirically measured. It's only something you get through a personal revelation, through personal experience. And as you just said, like as soon as you start trying to describe it, you immediately start falling away from the experience of it.
Yeah, I think Zen gets to that the most clearly of anybody when they say that if you are trying to put it into words because you think words are the channel of communication, you are wrong, because given what you're trying futilely to describe, the words will come to substitute for the reality and to obstruct contact with it. And so once that happens, now you've got a frozen theology about the thing, the whatever it is, the suchness, the thusness, the holy, the numinous, whatever it is. So to theologize about it is to betray it. And,
Right. And then as soon as you start saying it's exactly like this, then it becomes like an authoritarian principle,
mhm.
which is exactly what Christianity is. And Islam is that they're institutional and they have a specific doctrine and dogma that is institutionally enforced, and for which they brook no dissent. I mean, it's completely intolerant in terms of the theology. It's a one way is correct and everything else is wrong.
The idea of needing to have a correct theology reflects this well, obviously there's non-mystical understanding of things, because you imagine that revelation is the disclosure of hitherto hidden information. Oh yeah, there's a God, he's in heaven, this is what he has commanded, this is what he has stipulated one needs to do to attain salvation and all of that. And there he exists as a trinity, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the experience really is unnecessary. It becomes purely cognitive. A set of opinions is the important thing, and that's why they have inquisitions. Your opinions are not quite right. You're going to flunk that theology exam one day at the pearly gates. But the like that, and once it became clear in the Enlightenment and the dawn of criticism and science and all that, that there is no available knowledge of this kind available, that there are no scriptures that seem to be qualitatively different than human creations. They just have too many human fingerprints on them. Well, there are a couple of ways to go. One is to say, well, all right, I guess the doctrines probably are just a big mistake. It must be ethics. That's the important thing about religion. That's what Kant thought. He said the Bible stories about miracles, these are really like nursery school allegories for morality. The resurrection is repentance, et cetera, et cetera. But that soon becomes just an excuse for reducing religion to politics and nice guyism and a social club. But the other way to go is to become the knight of faith and to penetrate the forbidden precincts of revelation yourself. And like I just said, that doesn't imply you're going to get any real knowledge out of it, because it's beyond that. It's sort of an experiential gnosis. But does it even make sense to say that that beliefs that may accompany that are wrong? I mean, you're not even talking about things on that level. It's like in Vedanta, non-dualist Vedanta, and in ordinary Buddhism, they say the doctrines are not the real thing. I mean, you can have knowledge of them, but it's avidya. It's really ignorance. It's a kind of knowledge, but it's lower knowledge, like the knowledge of the content of a dream. But you can press on beyond that. And then it's meaningless to say, oh yeah, there's not 5 noble truths, there are 4, or there's not 3 persons in the Trinity, there's 12. That doesn't even come up anymore. So it's
right. I think
that's
my basic take on religion is just that we live in a fundamentally mysterious world where we don't really know what's going on, but we need to have some kind of narrative to make sense of it. And as a community, we come together around a given narrative. It almost doesn't even matter as long as it's useful. Mm-hmm. And that allows our communities to come together and have some structure. And from there, we can derive a set of morals, values, and ethics that allows us to have a functioning, as you say, a functioning social club in nice guyism, where we use these stories as a place to, bring our collected sense of morals together, because our moralities are socially constructed. They totally vary from one community to the next. Our morals on what to eat, or our morals on all sorts of things are totally variable from one society to the next, and from one time to the next. They vary over time. So they're very socially constructed and somewhat arbitrary. But I want to get back to this, my original topic here, which is that this sort of idea of the monotheism versus a duality. And monotheism is really, I think, I think the monotheists are actually quite proud of their uniqueness, and they've always celebrated their uniqueness among theology, and have always celebrated their monotheism as sort of being a superior intellectual model. I mean, would you agree with that they've traditionally held that kind of position?
Yeah, I think so. Oddly enough, perhaps the fundamentalist apologist Francis Schaeffer, who at least tried to engage broader thought, though I don't think he really knew what he was talking about some of the time, he had a couple of striking things to say. He said the gods of polytheism were not big enough. They're really like just bureaucrats in charge of different departments, and you have to bribe them to get prayers answered. And that monotheism is superior to all that, though it's not completely beyond that. Like you're buttering God up to say, you're so great. Let's see a little of that mercy and grace and so on. You're the greatest, not me. That kind of thing is still a kind of pathetic bargaining with the deity. But I think Schaeffer's point really was more made by the Stoics, who said really what you need to do to have an exalted view of God is to say that God is beyond personality, that Zeus is the divine logos that penetrates everything and is a part of everything, and so on. That seems to me really to be where monotheism is headed, and it's like a transitional stage to get to that. Spinoza saw that too, working from Judaism. There's not a guy who has a plan and opinions up in the sky. He can get mad at what we do. It's ridiculous. The God is just the logos or whatever. And so there's a point to that, but they're stopping short.
I don't disagree with any of that. But the point I was getting at is like these notions that when I started examining the idea of the father, that there once was a pairing of this father and mother, then the mother was eliminated, so it could be father alone. And that the mother has a specific set of traditions that were associated with her that were then get condemned, and that the behaviors are then condemned all the way through until today. And I noticed that when you look at it in terms of a duality, that this starts to line up with other traditions better. So in the Far East, we've got yin yang as like a duality of life. Ancient Egyptians talked about order and chaos. The Hindus, all their gods come in pairs of like male and female pairs. And so you got, and specifically Shiva and Shakti is the ones that I look at as sort of that universal, Shakti being the goddess head, the divine, the source of all. And then, and then for Native Americans as well, it translates back because they also notice that their notion of a sky father who created the universe dovetailed with, they could reconcile that with the Christian God. But at the same time, the Native Americans had Mother Earth, and there was no reconciling Mother Earth with the Christian tradition. So you see one half of it reconcile, the other half does not. Same thing with Hindu mystics and Christian mystics. They can reconcile their views of the Christian God with Brahma, but you can't reconcile anything about Shakti.
You've stopped. You're frozen.
Oh, we back?
No, it's okay.
All right. So I was going to say, comparing Christians with Hindus, the Christian can reconcile the Christian God with Brahma, and many philosophers and theologians will make this point from a Hindu perspective, that Brahma is the equivalent of this, monotheism. But they also have Shakti, which is the divine feminine, and there is no reconciling that part back with Christian monotheism. And that's where you see the connection to Asherah, because that's where the Asherah parts is that she does correspond to these Shakti traditions. And you see that monotheism as an political institution condemned with violence everything that was an expression of these feminine divine. So you see this in persecution of prostitutes, persecution of witches all through the Middle Ages. Anything that had like these feminine things where women were doing their own business on their own without the authority of a male. That's the kind of stuff that gets shut down and condemned for centuries.
The thing with prostitutes, I need to research this more, but it seems to me in the Old Testament, it's only hierodules or whatever, cult prostitutes as they're called, who are like the incarnations of Asherah, and the ritual sex in their religion was sympathetic magic to bring about fertility and all that stuff. But it's because they're part of this polytheistic religion that they're not liked, but just plain old prostitutes, unless they're married to somebody else, in which case turning tricks is adultery. I get the impression there's no real condemnation of what you might call secular prostitution in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a good point. But they certainly condemn the Kadesha, who are the
Yeah,
priestesses.
yeah.
I mean, they Kadesh them in the law, and this is something you see as a side point, that as you go through the histories of Mesopotamian law, in the old, from Hammurabi's law codes and the other ones, the very oldest ones, the Kadesha have the most rights, and as this with each successive generations, those Kadesha and equivalents, they are steadily losing their rights and losing their property rights until you get to the law code of Deuteronomy, which is sort of the last one, where they're completely put out of business altogether. And so you see this progression of them losing their esteem in society and their literally their property rights.
Isn't it interesting that in Joshua, Rahab is a heroine, even though she's a prostitute, but they don't make explicit that she almost has to have been a sacred prostitute, if for no other reason because of her name. She must have been a priestess of the god Rahab, the sacred dragon, also known as Leviathan, and so forth. Like in Job, it mentions those skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Well, there's a priesthood, just like there was in other adjacent religions, and she must have been one of them, but they don't tell you that. And I mean, you just have to know, hey, that name, well, wait a second. So that's kind of cleaned up. They didn't want to eliminate her, but she's sort of wearing a mask.
Right. Hey, could you adjust your camera a little bit? Because when you lean in like that, you're coming out of the frame. All right. Hey, great. Yeah. So I would like to get into the biblical evidence now, where we see, because I think this is actually the heart of the story right here, is that the general public does not understand this whole. The scholars have understand for a while now that the Israelites were pagans and then became monotheists later on. But the general public and your average Christians do not get and have not been told this, or not do not understand. And it took me a long time for me to even dawn on me that, like, wow, the entire history of the historical Israel, like, that was a pagan country. Like, that was their default religion, was that they were pagans. And they were not Jews. They never heard the term Jew. They were not monotheists. They didn't know anything about monotheism. El and Yahweh were two separate gods. And they were totally separate. And so then, and you've got this entire tradition. You got all this entire pantheon of gods, where Baal was the king of the gods, and you've got Asherah and Astarte and Anat and all the rest. That this was the default religion. And so, but then when they write the biblical narrative, they don't want you knowing about any of that. They want their theological, what they're trying to present, the case they're trying to make is that Yahweh, and it's been monotheism back to the beginning of time, and all of this paganism is just backsliding or foreign influence. I think that's why they want to put themselves in Egypt coming into Canaan, because it makes the Canaanites be foreigners to them, when in fact, historically, they actually were Canaanites and they were all worshiping the same gods.
Yeah, they're sort of scapegoating the Canaanites. I mean, it's very clear, even in the stories back in Genesis, that the Israelites are cousins, like literally, of the Ammonites, the Moabites, et cetera, because of all these genealogical links, that Lot was the father of the Moabites, and the Ammonites but he's the nephew of Abraham, who's also the father of Ishmael, and he's the father of 12 tribes and so forth. So they knew good and well that they were simply another brand of Canaanites. But why the huge difference that they're just disgusting, almost like Satanists in popular.
They vilify them to the highest degree.
And the reason they do that is they're trying to exorcise their own religious past. And like you say, the backsliding, they say, well, now we always knew this, that there was the one God, Yahweh, and so forth. But darn it, our ancestors got seduced again and again by those damn Canaanites. Well, no, those were your ancestors, and they must have known that at some point, but they said, oh no, we're a totally different bunch, and those rats gave us so much trouble. They caused us to stumble. No, you're trying to exorcise your own past. That was somebody else, and in a way it was you can see why they were doing it. I mean, they're like blaming the wrong people, but they're trying to say, hey, look, let's not be like that. That was never really us.
Well, they're reformers. They're cultural reformers. They're like segregationists or, segregationists or, anti-slavery advocates, anti-segregationists, right? They're trying to overturn existing cultural traditions that they object to, including all this shamanism and the sex rituals. The infant sacrifice is a huge thing that they like, and I think we would all agree, like, that is an outstanding reform. Thank you, Hebrew prophets, for overturning that quite vile tradition, which was scholars now know was a historical reality for the Phoenicians, that they really did have this tradition of sacrificing their babies for, as an answer to prayers. And it's really, it's a horrible tradition. So that's good. And, I don't think anyone disputes that there was ritual prostitution, that also obviously went away. Like, we don't do that anymore. It went away at a certain point. And so that's what these reformations are kicking off. And so that entire historical period from the time Yahweh enters the scene during the Bronze Age collapse, they're around, in the 12th century, and becomes a political force all the way through that entire history of Israel for the next 500-700 years. They're having this fight within the community over these various cultural traditions. And the Yahwists are these radical insurgent reformers who want to put these old traditions out of business. And at the top of the list are the ones with the women in the mystery religions. And so, where you see it in a few places in the Bible, particularly as we were saying about the stories of Asherah, where she was not just a goddess, but these carved wooden totem poles, which I totally associate as the same tradition, same primeval tradition as Native American totem poles and Siberian totem poles. And that, carved wooden poles are, a very, very old indigenous cultural practice that goes way, way back. And that's what these Asherah poles are, that they share some common primeval heritage. And so every time they talk about cutting down the Asherah pole, this is them trying to put the Asherah worship out of business.
Yeah, it's like the medieval, I guess, late antique iconoclasts. They thought it was terrible to have statues of Jesus and Mary and so on, so they would riot and destroy them all. I mean, history repeats itself.
Yeah, and so you see that all the way through the books of First and Second Kings. You see it. I think the first mention
my
of that
internet is probably to blame. Oh, now I can hear you.
Now you're back. I think the first mention is in Gideon with or in Judges with the story of Gideon, where Gideon gets an instruction to tear down the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole that is, quote unquote, that his father had built. That these were the ones that were within the community. So his father had built the altar. The Asherah pole, she's the mother goddess, and she stands next to, and Baal was the king of the gods. She stands next to him as not so much as a consort, she's his mother. So but she gives her approval. It's like her, the mother and the father. You see this in the Ugaritic text in the Baal cycle, where El gives the approval for Baal to become king of the gods, but Asherah was the one who had actually picked him. If you read the text, El waits for Asherah to make the choice, and then El stamps it with his approval. And then Asherah, El is like distant and removed from human affairs. He's kind of out in space, forming the cosmos, battling the Leviathan, doing all that. Whereas his son, but Asherah is much closer to the people. She is actually intimate with human affairs, and all the children are the gods that are actively around that people are praying to. So that's why Asherah is actively being worshipped, and that the poles are there as a tangible object. Whereas you don't really, well, the golden bull is the one for El. But that's the point of why the Asherah pole stands next to the altar of Baal. And then later on, we know from archaeology, there's the temple that they unearthed that's from the first temple period. It's not in Jerusalem, but it's in tell something where they found the pair of altars, the altar to Yahweh and the altar to Asherah right next to it. And then there is incense altars on them. And on one of the incense altars, they found cannabis. They found scientifically documented just recently in 2020 that there was cannabis residues, proving what people have been saying for a long time, that they're burning hashish incense, intoxicating incense in the temples.
Why did people think that before it was confirmed by archaeology?
Well, Sula Bennett was this is the name of the scholar who pointed out that the Kanabasm reference in Exodus 30:23 in the holy anointing oil of Moses, the Moses holy anointing oil, that one of the ingredients is cannabism, which is translated typically as this plant calamus, but calamus doesn't really have this like ritual legacy. She made the point that that's been a mistranslation. That's actually cannabis, and that tracks. And there's actually 5 references to it. Song of Songs has one of them, and then there's 3 others.
You pointed that out in the book. I'm just going senile. I forgot. Yeah.
And so, but that scholarship is still disputed by some people. But frankly, when you put the cannabis in context, it makes perfect sense, and it makes perfect sense. It was there the entire first temple period, and then it doesn't come back in the second temple. There's no. All the references to God showing up in a pillar of smoke and a pillar of cloud, that's all from the first temple, never comes back in the second temple. And so there's a bunch of references like that where it's all part of the pagan traditions. And it makes sense when you understand it as that, oh, it was a pagan thing that they did, because they were doing it all over the Near East and, Mesopotamia and Assyria and Egypt. It was a pretty common thing to do.
What do you think of John Allegro's notorious theory in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, that Jesus, like Soma, for instance, was a personification of, in this case, the sacred mushroom, whatever it was.
The idea of the psychedelic Eucharist, I think it's a very intriguing idea, and I can't prove it one way or the other. I think that the Eucharist itself represents a lot of questions because it's clearly not a Jewish tradition.
Right.
It's not, that eating my flesh and drinking my blood is not anything a Jewish person would say. So it comes from someplace else. And if it does come from the mystery religions, or it comes from some other Eastern influence thing, it's entirely possible that there's a psychedelic component to it. This certainly was relevant to the time period. But I couldn't prove it. But I do think that if you want to go down that path as like a modern day Gnostic and embrace a psychedelic Eucharist, that is a perfectly viable thing people can do, because psychedelics have been used in shamanism since forever, and people are still finding a lot of value in it today. So if you want to, I think we can make new myths if we want to. So if you want to make a new myth out of it, I think go for it. Is it the historical story? I have no idea.
For some reason, as I was thinking about this before we went on, I thought the closest thing to an overt survival of the wife of God, Asherah and all that, is Mrs. Claus, Santa's wife. Though she, even in the modern mythology that only little kids take seriously, she has no real role, but she's there. is the archetype. Jung said that he thought the Virgin Mary was in effect the fourth person of the Trinity, because that gap created by male monotheism was just nature abhorred the vacuum.
Yeah, I mean, I effectively agree. The Virgin Mary is definitely like the goddess being demoted and being knocked down a peg, knocked off her pedestal. But the culture wouldn't allow her to be eliminated altogether. You just need these human expressions still there.
Now, here's a weird theory of mine I've never heard anybody else say, but maybe they have. You know, in Acts 17, where Paul goes to the Areopagus in Athens and is preaching, and to the Stoics and Epicureans and so forth, he's being portrayed as being a new Socrates, and then he gets into trouble because they say this guy seems to be peddling new gods, plural, for he was preaching Jesus and anastasis, Jesus and resurrection. Well, I can't help thinking that that meant that the author of Acts was familiar with a form of Christianity that was just like the mystery religions, where Anat raises Baal from the dead, Cybele raises Attis, Aphrodite raises Adonis, and Isis and Nephthys raise Osiris. Well, I can't help thinking that that's who Anastasis was, a goddess resurrection who raised Jesus from the dead, and that's reflected in the as I was saying when we were both on a panel the other day. I can't help thinking either, maybe that's an index of my insanity, that the story of the anointing at Bethany originally belonged as part of the empty tomb story, but that originally Mary Magdalene and the others, Salome, Joanna, that they were, I mean, they're obviously the sacred women like in the other mystery religions.
Yeah. So if you saw the Gnostic Mystery Jesus short story that I wrote, that it's like, I'm just sort of playing with these themes. I'm not really presenting it as scholarship so much as a thought piece to say, hey, imagine that this is what it's like. And I totally present the three Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary, as like a representation of the triple goddess, of the goddess traditions, and that they are the ones raising Jesus because they're faking his death on the cross, and then they're the ones raising him back up, and that they are doing in the earthly flesh all of what these ancient mythologies had been doing for centuries, which was where a goddess raises a god and places him on the throne of majesty, and that here it is, it's Mary Magdalene doing that role, but in the earthly flesh, taking this god and turning him from a man into a god. And it's the women that are doing it because they're the sacred feminine and they're the ones making Jesus into the divine. And it's this whole way of blending these stories, all overlapping them all together.
Yeah. Great minds think alike.
So so I hadn't heard about the Anastasis one, but it's totally tracks with the same thing. It's basically these archetypes, like Jung says, you just change the names and the archetypes stay the same, especially across the Near Eastern traditions, like across all these neighboring traditions. It's a very much of a common model, and then you can just change the names. And then you get into the Gnostic mythology where they have these crazy names for the god and goddesses. And if you just ignore all those wild names and place them in the archetypes, you see the stories start to make sense. And when they talk about Yahweh being the demiurge and El being the monad, that just tracks with El and Yahweh being two separate gods in the pagan ways, and they're just putting new names on them.
Margaret Barker similarly says, why do you suppose it is that in the New Testament Jesus is called all the time the Son of God but never the Son of the Lord. That's very odd if people thought Lord stood for Yahweh and
Good
that's
point.
God. But if Jesus' Father is El Elyon, the Most High God, and Jesus is Yahweh appearing on earth in a theophany, that would explain it. I never even thought of that. But I thought, yeah, why else would they never call Jesus is called the Lord, the Kurios, which they call Yahweh in the Septuagint, but never the Son of the Lord? Why not? Well, that's a pretty good answer, I think.
Right, because there can only be one Lord. And when the new king of the gods has got to replace the old king of the gods. That's why you see Zeus has got to take out his father Kronos. Kronos took out Uranos before him. Baal had to fight to become king of the gods. So did Marduk. Every single one of them's got to replace the previous. There can only be one king of the hill. So you got to replace the previous king of the hill. But Yahweh and Jesus are both competing to be Lord. Who's actually the Lord? And is it Jesus or is it Yahweh? So they're both they're competing in that space, and I think that's what the Gnostics are getting at. They're like, Jesus is supposed to be the new Lord. We got to get rid of Yahweh and make Jesus the Lord and push Yahweh to the side. I kind of think that's what the Gnostics were talking about.
Yeah. It seems like it's just so natural to have this thing where Yaldabaoth is exulting, quoting Isaiah, I am God, there's none beside me. But then he hears laughter from above, and it's his mother, Sophia or whatever her name, saying, you got another thing coming, kid. And because there's the unknowable Father way above him. And that has to be a survival of Yahweh and Elyon. It just is too much of a coincidence otherwise.
No, I think that's a total pattern. I think it's a pattern that tracks all the way through. So, hey, can we talk about some of I want to, for like stuff that would be good for like your average Christian who's never heard any of this stuff, just hearing this for the first time, go through a couple of these pieces of evidence where I see the goddess in the Old Testament. So I want to start with Genesis 1, and where it says, so the opening of Genesis is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That's a clear, very clear line. And it was Joseph Campbell who pointed this out to me, that the waters, those words specifically, are a reference to these primordial mother goddesses from Mesopotamia. And that is, in fact, the mother, but going unnamed. Because it says God created the heaven and the earth, but it does not say God created the waters. The implication is that the waters were already there, because it doesn't say that God created the waters. And when you look at this as a response to earlier traditions of Mesopotamian mythology, specifically the Enuma Elish, which many scholars for many years have pointed out that the Enuma Elish is the Mesopotamian Babylonian creation epic where Marduk becomes the king of the gods and Marduk creates the world. But first thing, Marduk has to defeat Tiamat, and Tiamat was the primordial mother goddess who was the birth of everything, and she is called the salt waters because in Mesopotamian traditions, the source of the primordial first mover of creation was the salt waters. It was a primordial mother that gave birth to everything. That gave birth to her own husband, gave birth to her own mates, and gave birth to the entire universe. So for the Babylonians, that's Tiamat, who gives birth to Apsu, who is the fresh water. The salt waters gives birth to the fresh waters. And from there, they're the parents of all the gods. This parallel to this in the Greeks is Gaia, who is the primordial source of creation, is the primordial mother goddess who gives birth to Uranos, who's her husband. And from there, they're the parents of all the gods. Although the Gaia, they don't call Gaia the salt waters. That's a Mesopotamian tradition. So the Tiamat is, that's Babylonian. But then before that, there's another one. The Sumerian creation mother goddess is named Namu. And we don't have an entire story of hers, but we do have various references to her. And she was a common name that's used throughout Mesopotamian culture. There's various kings named Namu and that kind of thing. And so Namu is whereas Tiamat was a villain, she's a vicious mother goddess who needs to be defeated by Marduk. But when you go back 1,000 years before that to the earlier tradition, Namu was a kind mother goddess, and she gives birth to Ea, he gives birth to An, who is the sky father, who's the same as El, and she gives birth to Ki, whose name is also Ninhursag. She's the mother goddess, and then An and Ki means heaven. Those words mean heaven and earth, and then Anki together meant like the world. That was the world. That was a word for the world. The heavens and the earth together is Anki, and that's the two gods, the god and goddess, An and Ki, as separate characters. But An becomes El. He's the very old sky father, and they give birth to all the other gods. And in the oldest generation of stories, Namu is kind and she's beneficent. She helps creates humans, and she's generally nice, or she's all around nice. 1,000 years later, it's a new culture has come through. The Babylonians are a new people group. It's a new political regime. They're overthrowing the previous political regime. So now the previous regime has to be portrayed as in a negative light to justify the new regime coming along and defeating them. So that's why, in my interpretation, Namu now becomes Tiamat. Namu goes from being kind to being vicious and being a villain that needs to be defeated for the generation of Marduk and Tiamat. Then we go 1,000 years later to the Old Testament Genesis story. Now the waters, she's not even a villain. Now her name has been entirely taken away, and she doesn't even have an identity.
Is Tiamat.
And then there is the Tiom is also another line, and the deep, it's not the waters, but it's another word. The deep is Tihom, and that's considered to be a cognate to Tiamat that scholars have also pointed out. So that's a different word in the same sentence, but again, it's speaking to the same thing. We are aware that our older traditions talked about a primordial mother goddess, but since we are monotheists who only believe in the Father alone, and we don't believe that there's a divine mother, we don't want you to ever know there was a divine mother, we're going to take away her name. And the giving of a name and vice versa, the taking away of a name is a very powerful theological, symbolic thing that they do, that they talk about, that the power of giving something a name in biblical terms is to give it an identity, is to give it a purpose, to give it a meaning, to give it, a rock is just a rock, but if you give the rock a name, call it Steve. Now Steve has a story. Steve has a biography. Before it was just a rock, and now it's a character. And so by taking away the name of the waters, they are reducing her. They are de-deifying her. They're undeifying her. They're taking away her divine identity. But they could have just not said the waters at all. They didn't have to put that sentence there. They felt the need to put that sentence there for a reason. And I believe that they're speaking to an audience at that time for whom that would have been a very relevant reference.
Well, in the same way, in the J creation account, the Garden of Eden, the serpent has to originally have been Nehushtan or Leviathan.
We'll get to the Garden of Eden story. That's the last one. So we'll hold that thought, and we'll come back to Garden of Eden story. So Genesis 1, and I'm going to do another thought piece. I'm going to write this up soon, where I put these three creation stories together in context to show that in the oldest traditions, the mother goddess was very kind and revered. 1,000 years later, she's lost a step, and then 1,000 years after that, she's been completely knocked off her pedestal. When you take the stories of Namu, then the story of Tiamat, and then the story of Genesis 1, and show them in one long context, that there is a long, slow cultural shift happening where the women are losing their rights and these goddess traditions are being devalued. So do you think that's a decent argument there?
Yeah, if I can transgress into Eden again for a second, it contains a great display of that, because the woman is created as a companion to the man, not like a housemaid, Eitzer, a help, a word usually used of God, or once of King David. But then she becomes Lucy Ricardo and Alice Cramden. She's too curious for her own good. She gets her husband in trouble, and because of that, no more equality for you. I mean, that's almost explicitly what you're
Yeah.
just
So
saying.
let's go ahead and talk about the Garden of Eden story. So, yes, I think the Garden of Eden story is a 100% a shot across, not even a shot against the brow. It's a full-on broadside against Asherah and the goddess traditions and the Kadesha priestesses. That all, not only that the serpent is clearly the serpents were a really powerful symbol of divination and magic and wisdom in the ancient world. Moses carries around a serpent staff, and he puts, as you mentioned, in Nehushtan, that he builds, the bronze snake on a pole that has magical powers. At the time of Moses, the snake was still a very positive, revered thing, a positive symbol. And across the Near East, in goddess temples, snakes were all over the place. They would breed snakes. They liked snakes because they kept the rodents out of the granaries, and they would do magic with snakes. And so you see it in not in Cyprus, but in
Crete.
In Crete, yeah, they've got all the statue of the priestess holding snakes, and there's all sorts of snake references all over. You see it in the iconography, snakes crawling up a tree. It's a really common symbolism, and it was especially common for the goddesses, that like snake handling and snake holding was all like a really common motif. And so what in these religious reforms, when they're trying to put those traditions out of business, they turn the snake from a symbol of something positive to a snake into something negative. It now becomes a villain. It's becoming they're taking away its value, and they're saying that now it used to be good, but now no longer, it's no good anymore. Similar to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, I argue that it's cannabis, and I argue that cannabis has been sacred in the goddess tradition for a long time. It's used as a fiber, it's used as a midwifery medicine, aphrodisiac. It's a whole other subject unto itself. That said, I think that when they gain wisdom, they eat from the tree of knowledge and they gain wisdom from it. I believe that this is totally a reference to shamanistic, entheogenic type traditions where people are gaining experience from psychedelic type. They're gaining wisdom from psychedelic experiences, plant drugs in general, cannabis specifically. And that again, the followers of Yahweh want to put those traditions out of business. They don't approve, and they're saying, we don't want you doing this. We don't want the women in our community are not allowed to do this anymore. And so again, it's a shot at the Kadesha, because that's exactly the kind of thing that they did. Was they were mixing up mystery potions. They were making, midwifery medicine, and they were the potion makers and the wise women of the community. That was one of the things. That was one of the roles that they had. The same kind of stuff that gets persecuted as witchcraft in the Middle Ages is the same thing that these priestesses were doing. It was well,
even in the mandate. Bible, the witch of Endor, so-called, she's a spirit medium, and Saul has banned all of them. Why? Well, because if you claim the divine mandate and you have approved methods of getting revelations from God, like the Urim and Thummim and the ephod, whatever that was, these are controllable. In fact, they may just be ventriloquist dummies to give you what you already believe. But if you have other channels, ostensible channels of revelation, like necromancy, calling up the dead, which is what she was doing, to answer your questions, or astrologers, Isaiah condemns them. It's because you're going to a now unauthorized source of information. I can't do that.
Centralized, institutionalized, political control over theology and over spirituality and over revelation, that if it's not coming from the approved channels, then it's not allowed. And it's about the institutional power and authority takes prevalence over these other mystical traditions and mystical sources of mystical insight or wisdom. It's the same thing with the Gnostics. Why the Orthodox Christianity hated the Gnostics was because they were not going through the central authority of the priests, and they were encouraging people to find their own wisdom. That's
That
exactly what's
sounds like
happening. That's exactly what's happening there in the Garden of Eden. They're finding their own wisdom. And then Yahweh is saying, don't do that. I don't want you finding your own wisdom through plant drugs. I mean, to me, it couldn't be any more clear.
This sounds like some sort of subversive conspiracy theory, but no, there's plenty of other historical analogies, like the reason the Catholic Church tries to keep the lid on Marian apparitions, grudgingly, eventually, if they can authenticate it, render it safe, they'll say, oh, okay, you can go to Lourdes. But this other one, I'm not so sure about. Oh, this is why in the early church, the bishops had the relics of the martyrs from the countryside shrines and brought them into the city so that they could have the only locus of supernatural power that the people were finding on their own in these outlying things. I mean, it happens again and again. The whole idea of a canon of scripture is the same thing again. We'd rather you not read the Gospel of Thomas because you might start believing in the pre-existence of souls. No. Only these, and exactly. So on.
And so, and then more from Adam and Eve. You know, she is created to be submissive, with instruction to be submissive to Adam and to be monogamous to Adam and only have desire for her own husband. Well, again, this is a direct contradiction to the existing pagan traditions, which were explicitly not monogamous. They were not a monogamous culture. Ishtar was the most popular goddess of the Near East, was a prostitute who did not believe in monogamy as a matter of principle. And they've got maternal bloodline, so it doesn't really matter who the women have sex with. Now that gets imposed over time, over long, paternity doesn't get imposed in one night. But there was one cultural group that wants paternity and wants to track bloodlines through the father. And there were existing cultural traditions where bloodlines were tracked through the mothers, and the mothers did not feel so obligated to only have sex with one man. So in the transition, in this cultural reformation to bring about paternity and monogamy, they've got to put an end to the old traditions that celebrated. If you got a religious tradition that tells the girls to go out and go to the temple and engage in ritual prostitution and keep the babies for yourself and not tell the father, they're trying to put those traditions out of business. And so they say that Eve, they instruct her to only be submissive to Adam, and that this is your divine command, and this is the divine command for all women ever since. And to your point about Lucy Ricardo, Eve is a direct parallel to Pandora in the Greeks, which is a story around a story that's written around the same time. Pandora's story might be a little bit older, but they're more or less around the same era. In both cases, the first woman is created as the source of all men's trouble. Like, where did all the bad stuff happen? It happened from the very first woman. She is the one who brought out Pandora, opens the box, it unleashes all the evils on the world. It's Eve who tricks Adam, or lures Adam into the first original sin. It's these first women, and it's this grand effort in scapegoating women for like all the world's ills. I kind of wonder if they're not scapegoating women for the Bronze Age collapse, and saying it's all your fault that civilization fell apart for a couple hundred years.
There's one thing, they're not trying very hard to disguise who Eve really is by having Adam name her that, because it's the same as Hebe or Heba, who was in she was like a kind of a clone of Cybele. In Greece, she was a wife of Hercules, and they didn't even change the name.
What's the name?
Eve is another version of Heba or Hebe. And so what does Adam say? He named her that because she's the mother of all living.
That's the point I was just about to make. That is something they called Asherah. That was a title of Asherah. That was a title of a lot of mother goddesses.
Aruru and so on. Yeah, come on.
The mother of all living. And that's actually how I've come to associate my duality theology. Is like, for me, the Father is the deist God who puts the universe in order, and the mother is the mother of all living. And she's the mother of all life. And to me, those two fit together in my mind as a theological model.
Hmm.
But yeah, so all of this Garden of Eden story is this full-on shot against these traditions of the Kadesha priestesses and Asherah, and how they're going to put them out of business and say, we're going to reorder the genders and reorder our gender roles in society to make sure there's no confusion about our daughters. And there's not going to be any, we're not going to have any competing narratives telling our daughters what to do or how to behave, because all the surrounding cultures were still totally pagan, and they're still doing all of this. The ritual prostitution continued for another 1,000 years. So they're still living within a community where it's still going on all around them, but they want to make sure their daughters are not being tempted by it.
Well, the levirate marriage law, the only reason for that, this guy dies without begetting a son to inherit, the next male next of kin has to impregnate the widow if he can, and so on down the line. The story of Onan, right? And what's the point of that? Male inheritance. The property has to go along the male line, which is just the opposite of what you described. So there's another one where the agenda is in plain view.
Exactly. Yeah. The agenda is in plain view. So that's the main. So I think we agree. I think, that the Garden of Eden story. So it also brings the question, like, St. Augustine's interpretation of the Garden of Eden story as original sin and sex as original sin. Because it's my understanding that by the time you get to Augustine in the 3rd century AD, that people sort of didn't know what to think of the Garden of Eden story, that it sort of become this folktale that people didn't really have a good sense of what it meant. And they didn't really focus on it. And there was Augustine who focused on it and turned it into the story of original sin. And that it has taken that meaning ever since. And that it was Augustine who really kicks off our interpretation that we have of that story now. And all these other interpretations we're just talking about are completely forgotten because people don't even remember that these pagan goddess traditions ever existed in the first place, which was entirely their goal. They want you to not even know these goddesses ever existed in the first place.
Yeah, blotted out of the book of life. Lilith is another interesting one. This is a later rabbinic, what's called an exegetical legend, to come up with a story that would harmonize a contradiction. How come Genesis 1 says seems to say God created male and female at the same time, but in Genesis 2, there's the man, then the animals, then the woman as an afterthought, very explicitly. And the rabbi said, wait a minute, I thought the woman was created simultaneously with the man. So they came up with the idea, well, she was Lilith, who was uppity. She wouldn't be subservient. She wanted to be on top during sex. Adam said, no way. And she said, look, I'm not hanging around to be your mattress. I'm out of here. And so she then shacked up with Samael and became the night hag, the ancient explanation for sudden infant death syndrome. The baby died, crib death. Oh, well, that's Lilith. Right. But I mean, come on, that's even more explicit than the Eden story.
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely speaks to the idea that there was an older tradition of feminists, of a feminine that was not submissive to males, which is exactly what you see in the stories of Ishtar and Anat, is that they're not submissive to the males. This is the critical thing with the Bronze Age pagan traditions versus the Iron Age traditions, is that in the older ones, these goddesses are not submissive to the patriarchy. Like literally Ishtar in all of her stories is never submissive to any male character. She steals some of An's authority. She goes to heaven. She goes to Enki and steals the tablets of destiny, or not tablets of destiny, but the Mies that are the divine laws. She goes to, she sends her husband to hell, Tammuz. She did not submit to any male character ever. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're starting to rise against her. And that's a big part of the story, is that Gilgamesh won't submit to her. And that's like a big insult. That's like the first time anyone's ever dared insult Ishtar. But that's like also marking the beginning of the end. It's the first time, but not the last. And so this older generation, you see these goddesses are not submissive to any male characters at all. They're not submissive to any sort of patriarchy. But as you come into the Iron Age, both with the Hebrews and with the Greeks, and you see it quite explicitly with the Greeks, all the Greek goddesses are submissive to Zeus, with the exception of Demeter. But Athena and Aphrodite, they don't challenge Zeus's authority anywhere. None of the goddesses do. Like I said, the only exception is Demeter. And she is, the kind of the Greek mother goddess. And so she is the other most powerful deity, most culturally important deity for the Greeks was Demeter in the Eleusinian mysteries. And so, so yeah, there's this notion that they have to make, especially the sexual goddesses, make them submissive to the men was an important cultural agenda that they had. And so they knock, I say that Aphrodite Urania was the older version of Aphrodite, where she has all of her war powers. She's goddess of love and war, and just like Ishtar, and she's the queen of heaven. But then the Aphrodite of the Olympian gods is called Aphrodite Pandemos, and she is not the goddess of war. She's just the goddess of sex, and she's kind of a bimbo, and she's not really all that powerful. She doesn't do any divination. She's not the queen of heaven. She's just the sex goddess, really, sex and beauty and desire. But Athena gets all the powers of war and divination and the powers of civilization. That's all given to Athena. But Ishtar was the older Ishtar was actually like Athena and Aphrodite combined into one super goddess.
I hate to say it, I've got to get going.
Okay.
But I'd like to talk again soon. There's other stuff on the topic I'd like to talk.
I was hoping to talk about Hosea and Gomer. If you got 5 minutes before you run, that's a story that we didn't really get into. But I think the whole book of Hosea and the whole part of his wife Gomer is also that I think Gomer is a Kadesha, almost certainly.
Yeah.
And
I think that's right.
And that as you go through the lines where Hosea is talking to Gomer, and it's also like Yahweh talking to, it's a poetic allegory where it's Yahweh talking to Asherah, it's Yahweh talking to Israel. Hosea is talking to Gomer and saying, I'm going to end your festivals. I'm going to make you only love me. I'm going to make you stop going with these other men and only come back to me by myself. That is, I think, again, another iteration of the Hebrew prophets shutting down the goddess traditions.
Yeah, I think it's virtually explicit, but though nobody seems to see it, but it's there in plain sight.
So, I'd like to have more of these discussions.
Yeah,
with people,
sure.
And also with some Christians too. Like, I don't like I would like to have a discussion with some Christians if, we can talk about this offline or something, but trying to have some more, break this conversation out to some more people that haven't really been talking about it.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of nominees. Yeah. Well, I do have to think.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. All right. So we're going to wrap it up. Lost Goddess IO, Edward Dodge here. Thank you very much, Dr. Price. It's been a real pleasure. And I hope
terrific.
I hope we can do it again soon. And it's a lot of fun.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right.